So before we go to the heart of HTA, I think a good place to start would be just taking a broader look, a broader perspective on HTA. And so this is the first um, discussion point, a poll that we have. So the question is, what are the aims of an HTA program? And on this slide, you see there are 11, I put 11 on it, 11 possible reasons why anybody may want to set up an HTA program. I'm not going to read them out, but what we'll do now is we'll go to a poll, and what I'd like you to do is look at the list carefully and say, if you think, how many of these aims do you think are relevant from the point of view of an HTA program? And of course, you can choose all or none, and you can choose some, which is options 2, 3, and 4. So maybe we'll go straight to the poll, if that's okay. But Bernardo, are you setting up the poll for me? Or I can pull the poll, can't I?
There you go.
Okay.
So people are voting. Oh, 7%. We have 14 people. We are looking who's voting, so you cannot no vote.
Okay. I think we have 10, 12, 13. I'm not voting, so. Okay.
You're watching the result, because perhaps I have to share a screen.
Okay. So is everybody able to see that? So what we have is a majority people think about 4 to 6 of these aims are relevant. 4 people think all, and a couple of people think that it's just 1 to 3. So maybe we could start with who voted to say 1 to 3. Would someone like to maybe share with the group which those 3 are? You know who you are. Someone volunteer? No. Okay. Someone said all. 4 of you said all of them are relevant aims. So I was just would someone who said all of them are relevant like to justify why?
I did, because I was lazy to pick up some of them, so it was easier for me. No, I'm kidding. I believe that it's hard to, perhaps there are some points that are not especially important in the HTA program, but for me, for example, I'm interested in innovation, and HTA program could be both ways. It can improve, or allow to improve innovation or to restrict innovation. So I was hesitating with that point, but the rest I'm curious to know your opinion.
Okay. Anybody like to add to that? For example, is I would question whether the aim of an HTA program is patient participation. It may be a good feature of the program. I mean, you could argue it either way. Maybe it's to give patients a voice in what the health service provides. No. Okay. Fine. I think, unlike most presenters, you would now get the right answer. The answer is, I don't know the answer. That an HTA program can have various aims, and all of these, I think, are in some way relevant. Some of them more so to NICE, the HTA program at NICE, but if you look more widely across the world, you can see that HTA programs are set up to achieve all of these aims. So we shouldn't think of HTA as just one process or a program that sets out with a single aim. it can be various things. I'm now going to carry on. Can you see the slideshow again? Okay.
Yes.
Perfect.
So one of the main aims that an HTA program is set up is in response to rising costs within healthcare. And whenever you talk about costs for healthcare, the best place to go to is the USA. And I have here some work which was done, and which you can see in America between 1960 and about 2000. We can see that healthcare expenditure as a percentage of GDP is gradually increasing. And if we project it and we say that the increase in healthcare expenditure is 2% more than the increase in GDP, we see that by about 2075, so that's in about 55 years, the healthcare budget is about 80% of GDP. So in the case of the USA, that leaves no money left for the military. We can, of course, even if we say that the excess spending increase on health compared to the GDP is 0.5%, we see that towards the end of this century, we have about a quarter of the GDP of the biggest economy in the world being spent on health. And it's things like this that people were looking at that I think spurred a lot of the need to institute some form of making sure that the money that was being spent wisely. From the same article, there's an estimate from 2 studies of what is driving the increase in healthcare costs. And if we see the yellow boxes in both these studies, we see that the largest proportion of increasing healthcare costs is due to technological change. So the increasing availability of technologies for use within healthcare is what's driving healthcare costs increasing. Other things are too, and we'll take a look at what those are. Here's another study from a much more recent study from 2017, looking at 5 drivers of healthcare costs. And we see that service utilization, if anything, has decreased, as has the prevalence and incidence of disease itself. Despite this, an increasing age of the population and increasing size of the population are driving increases in healthcare spending. This is again in the USA. We see the little red dot on the right, which says service price and intensity, which is by and far the largest reason that for the healthcare cost to increase in the USA. And the authors of this paper say that the service price and intensity is a surrogate for technological change and the increasing use of technology within healthcare. So once again, we see that technology being used within the healthcare system is driving cost increases, and it would be a good place to look at if you wanted to control costs. A further diagram from the same publication, and here again we see that patients have moved from inpatient care to ambulatory care. And the little red box at the end, the red rectangles at the end are again what's driving costs. And we see again it's that technology change. And we see when we look at in the middle prescribed retail pharmaceuticals, we see that there's an increasing utilization of pharmaceuticals, but also an increasing price and intensity that is driving change. So whichever way we look at this, we can see that the use of technology and pharmaceuticals probably are driving increases in healthcare budgets. And one of the major reasons that health technology assessment programs are set up is to address this issue of rising costs. The simple question to ask is, how do you set the price of a pharmaceutical? Most things we buy, we just go to the shop and we decide what we want and if we can afford it. Surprisingly enough, pharmaceuticals don't fall into that group. So in what way is healthcare and pharmaceuticals different? And the basic issue is that the price that a patient pays and the value that a patient gains from pharmaceuticals and health technologies are not related to one another. And this is because of issues such as the pharmaceutical company having a fixed cost for development and then having a monopoly on the drug for a while. So there is no market price mechanism. We have information uncertainty between a principal and an agent. That means that people don't know when they're going to get sick. And when they fall sick, they don't even know what they need. So they need to go to a doctor who's going to tell them what it is that they need. So in a sense, you don't have someone freely able to purchase with information the treatments they need from healthcare. Someone has to mediate that relationship for you. The timings of the need for healthcare is uncertain. No one can say when they're going to become unwell. And compounding this uncertainty is the fact that when you fall unwell is when you're least likely to be able to afford to pay for expensive things, because the illness probably has an impact on your employability too. The response, of course, to uncertainty is insurance. And once you're insured, then people, again, not facing the real price of the drugs. So we have these issues that pervade healthcare. And another way of putting it is that it's in healthcare, you inevitably have market failure. It's designed into the system. So the big question we're going to try to answer today is how do you then align price and value? So here's a little fun fact. The question is, why do we say health technology assessment? Or in no other field, when we're talking about pharmaceuticals or devices or diagnostics, do we say health technologies? You'll see that the only place we say health technologies is when we talk about HTA. So there's a history to this, and the first set of technology assessments were done by an Office of Technology Assessment, which was part of the US Congress from 72 to 75. And they did technology appraisals, whatever that was, whether that was roads or bridges or dams. These were all technologies. And so when the first healthcare products came into this program, they called them health technologies. And that has carried over. The program was closed down in 95, apparently, by Republicans, who said that every time you had a scientific assessment, the results seemed to come out against them. So I think the other thing we see is that this refusal of the science, which seems to be largely much more pervasive today, seems to have a long and distinguished history in the US Congress. So I think most of you will be familiar. So just a quick recap, what is cost effectiveness? So what we do is we measure incremental health effect compared with standard of care. We convert that health effect into a composite of the length of survival and the quality of life, which we call a QALY, which is a measure of health benefit. We measure incremental costs compared to the standard of care, and we calculate an incremental cost effectiveness ratio, which I'll call the ICER. And here, for example, we see some every QALY gain costs you £270. And to operate someone for a malignant tumor within the cranium, you're paying roughly £100,000. It's clear that you get more bang for your buck. You buy more health with smoking cessation rather than managing intracranial malignant tumors. So it becomes quite easy now to compare across interventions to see where it's a good idea to spend your money. So once you've estimated cost effectiveness, the question is, how do you then use it to make a decision? So one way of using cost effectiveness is you have the cost effectiveness, you have multiple other criteria you want to take into consideration, and all cost effectiveness is just one input into that decision. It's nothing more. The second way of using it is something called league tables that we'll discuss. And the third is by using a threshold. And I think that's going to be the focus of today's, most of today's presentation. So before we go on, we should broadly think of the different kinds of cost effectiveness threshold, the CETs, and as they're on the slide, called cost effectiveness threshold. They're broadly speaking two kinds. One is called on the demand side, and either you could base it on the GDP of a country, or you could run some kind of studies where you look at stated or revealed preferences of individuals and how much are they. Either you can ask them, what are you willing to spend for a particular improvement in health, and from that deduce what the value of a QALY is, or you could actually look at revealed preferences. What is it that their people are spending money on towards gaining health or avoiding bad health? And these are the two broad approaches. The criticisms, of course, are that what a person is willing to purchase for themselves is not necessarily the same as what they're willing to pay for healthcare for the population as a whole. And what a person is willing to pay may not have any relationship to actually what the healthcare system can afford. So by and large, demand side cost effectiveness thresholds are not that popular. They are used in places, but they're not that popular. Here's one place where a demand-based threshold is popular, and this is the WHO threshold based on GDP. What they assume is that the value of a healthy year is per capita income. So each person produces per capita income, and that's the value of that life. It's not an ethical perspective, but it's based on the premise that, if that's what one life produces in a year, then that's what you should be willing to pay to save that life for a year. And the WHO says that if the price per DALY averted, which is what the WHO uses, is less than the average per capita for the country or region, then that's cost effective. Up to 3 times GDP per DALY averted is still cost effective. Above 3 times, it's not cost effective. This is not an empirical based threshold. Just if you put it in there, in 2015, we're looking at the two UK thresholds of 20,000 and 30,000 pounds per QALY. We see that we're somewhere in the region of we're around 1 time the GDP of the UK as far as our threshold goes. Here's another graph that looks at various countries that do have thresholds, and it plots them, and the yellow lines on this graph are, at the bottom is 1 time GDP, and the upper yellow line is 3 times GDP. And if we see, most countries are somewhere between the threshold is somewhere between 1 and 3 times the GDP. There are countries that are well above, like Belgium, and some countries like Thailand, which spend less than their GDP per DALY averted. The other type of cost effectiveness threshold is something what we call the supply side. And this is probably where there's been a lot more interest, because the logic seems to follow what HTA is trying to achieve. So the one is to say that paying for new treatments, what it's doing, it's moving healthcare expenditure within the system at the margins. And what the threshold does is it represents the marginal productivity of the healthcare system. This has been criticized, as we'll see later, because estimating this is difficult, largely because the kind of data doesn't exist, and a statistical phenomenon called endogeneity, where when you're trying to look at the relationships between spending on health and healthcare outcomes, they influence each other in both directions. So it's in part, increased healthcare spending may be the result of worse outcomes rather than the relationship going only in one direction. As I said, we'll talk about an example of league tables, which will explain why these have not become popular. But what this assumes is that you can have a list of all the treatments that your healthcare system offers and know what their cost effectiveness is. And then you can make a decision by just using the ones which are most cost effective at the top of the table. And then you work your way down the table until your budget is exhausted, and then whatever else comes after that, you don't offer at all. One of the problems with using league tables is, of course, is that you don't have comprehensive information, and new technologies come on one at a time. They don't all land up at the same time. So you need to have some way of fitting a new technology into a cost-effectiveness table. The third way is just to look at historical precedent. For example, why in the USA is 50 to 100,000 pounds per QALY widely used. Again, no empirical basis, though it's possible that the 50K threshold came because that was renal dialysis. That's what his cost effectiveness was, and people said, well, you can't not offer people renal dialysis. So that became then the threshold at which everything else got judged. The United Kingdom, that's NICE's threshold of 20 to 30K per QALY, is also a historical precedent. It's not an empirical estimate. Just quickly to think about opportunity costs. So the NICE threshold represents an opportunity cost. So it's telling you what is being displaced. What do you have to give up to spend your money on a new intervention? So, and what's being displaced is the opportunity, and what is its cost. Interestingly, if we think of the two types of thresholds I talked about, one is the demand side, which here is called V, which is the consumption value of health. It's how people trade off between health and the other things that they could consume their money on. And if we talk about K, which is the marginal productivity of health, which is the supply side CET, ideally, you would have these somewhere, the ballpark would be similar figures. And that's because if people are willing to pay more than what the health system uses as its threshold, it means that the health system is not in some way reflecting preferences of the population. So this is in 1989, Oregon set up one of probably the first rational rationing program, and they set this up as an experiment, and they didn't really use league tables, but they used a lot of expert opinion and cost effectiveness to rank pairs of interventions, disease and interventions, and then they provided everything which was really ranked highly, and as they went down the list, they stopped providing things. And this worked. Well, I don't think it particularly worked because it ran up against a child called Kobe Howard, who was a 7-year-old child with a leukemia, I think. And Oregon and Oregon told him that he couldn't have his leukemia treated on Medicaid or Medicare. And of course, this was completely unacceptable to the public, largely because if you have a league table, you end up giving people treatments which are cheap, but are possibly not that important in terms of of the kind of outcomes you want to prevent by using a healthcare system. And essentially that you wouldn't treat kids with cancer. And I doubt I have to convince anybody that that's just not a good idea to set up a system that doesn't treat kids with cancer. So anyhow, so I think Oregon got knocked for this, and after that, of course, you'll find a lot in the literature, saying that, that it's discriminatory, and it lasted until it met something called the rule of rescue. There were also other criticisms made of it, and I don't think, as far as I know, anybody's tried to use that methodology again. So what is the NICE cost effectiveness threshold? NICE does not have a threshold. NICE has a series of thresholds which start at £20,000, taking certain considerations, move to £30,000 per QALY, take into consideration end of life to move to £50,000 per QALY, and then for rare diseases, weights QALYs, so up to £300,000 per QALY. So when we say what is the NICE threshold, the first thing to say is that there isn't a NICE threshold. There are a series of thresholds at NICE. Now, the rationale behind NICE's cost effectiveness threshold is that you compare your ISA to the threshold, and the threshold tells you what is being displaced. And if you're paying more for the same QALY with another intervention, it makes sense to replace it because you're getting more bang for your buck with something that's more cost effective. So the first idea is, it says it's displacing something else, and it should be displacing things that are less cost effective. And if you repeat this process for each new intervention you're willing to spend on, you displace something that is less cost effective than that. Overall, your system becomes more efficient in that for the same spend, you're going to be buying yourself more health. You're going to have more QALYs. So the idea is that through newer treatments, which are more cost effective, displacing older treatments, which are less cost effective, your health system becomes efficient. Another one of the assumptions it makes is that what we call what I've heard called the perfect divisibility of healthcare programs. So that's the idea, is that if you introduce something that's cost effective, it'll have a certain budget impact, right? And you want to displace, say, another service or intervention that's not cost effective. It is very unlikely that what's being displaced will have the same budget impact as what you're introducing. And it's not possible to disinvest in half of an intervention. So you have to either nobody gets it or everybody gets it. And that's one of the reasons NICE was set up, to prevent a postcode lottery of availability to drugs. So one of the things any threshold-based decision-making, the way NICE theoretically holds it to be, is that there needs to be some assessment made of whether the budget impact and divisibility of healthcare programs. So that's NICE in theory. That's what it hopes to achieve. So what actually happens in practice? And I don't think it'll surprise anyone if I say that what does not happen in practice is that every time the NHS introduces a new treatment, that they go away and look at what is cost ineffective, what is less cost effective, and stop doing that. That simply doesn't happen. What happens instead, I think, is illustrated by this paper from 2007, which tried to look at what are decisions made at the local level about service investment and disinvestment in response to changing budgets. So they interviewed public health directors and finance directors from 6 PCTs. And this is what they found, that the decisions of the changes that were introduced into the system were based on clinical and non-economic factors. So as a matter of practice, disinvestment in the NHS is not informed by cost effectiveness. Most of the decisions that were taken were not to cut services or add services, but to reconfigure the way services were delivered, okay? Such as waiting list initiatives, which probably is another way of saying learning to manage people being upset that they're on a waiting list. One of the things this study found is that no decisions on the margin were based on cost effectiveness, and that the way changes were justified by, again, not based on this is not cost effective, but on an overall cost impact and on a business case. So in practice, in the NHS, we are not meeting the requirement for more cost-effective treatments to displace less cost-effective treatments. Now, one of the problems when you use a cost-effectiveness threshold, because it is so important to decision-making, it pretty much begs the question, what is the threshold? Right? As I told you, the NICE thresholds were historical thresholds. These are not, we have no idea if this is actually the marginal productivity of the healthcare system. So this is a major piece of work, and for people, sadists who may wish to, punish themselves for a couple of days, please do go and take a look at the HTA. It is actually a dream as far as econometrics goes. But what they did is they look at program budgeting data in the English NHS to look at changes between overall NHS expenditure and changes in mortality. So within 23 program budgeting categories, which are really disease categories, there were changes that within the budget. And then they were able to look at those changes in expenditure and relate it to mortality over the next 2 years. So they were then able to weight that loss of life or quality of life, and in some way people who fell ill may not necessarily even die. So there was a management of this issue of what is the quality of life, so as to be able to calculate a QALY. And they reached the central threshold of 12,936 per QALY, and that's based on 2008 expenditure. The probability of that the threshold is below 30,000 is you're almost certain, which is quite convenient. So this, as far as we know, is the best estimate we have of the marginal productivity of the NHS. Fine. So we're going to do another poll now, and let's see if what you think should happen to the threshold for inflation, right? What should happen to the threshold if the healthcare budget increases? And what should happen to the threshold if the GDP increases, right? So your options in the poll are that they all increase, whether, you should increase the threshold for all three. You shouldn't change the threshold for any. And third is it depends. Depends means yes for some and no for others. Anyway, depends is doing well. Okay.
I finished them. I ended them.
Okay. Okay, I'll stop the share for a while. Does anybody someone said, one person said stay the same. So fess up, who was it? And tell me why you think that. Bernardo, can you tell who said what? Then
nice for too long. I don't count. So let's other people.
No, I cannot because I put it as an anonymous Ellie.
Okay. Okay, so let's maybe we say who thinks that the threshold should go up for inflation? I mean, okay. Does anybody want to say, to explain why it shouldn't?
Depends. Was the inflation actually when was this? Was it actually in the formula? Because usually you do put some inflation threshold per year, whatever.
Yeah, you inflate or deflate prices to a reference year for an economic analysis.
Exactly, the year dollar. So
yeah, okay. But the question is that over time, okay, should your threshold change for inflation? We see that when NICE was set up at £30,000 per QALY, we were paying 1.76 times the GDP. In 2015, that was 1.04 times the GDP. Admittedly, the GDP had risen in that time too. But would anybody like to explain the case for increasing the threshold to account for inflation? Okay.
No,
again, there is no right answer, by the way. So you can say whatever you want, and I'm not going to tell you you're right or wrong, because honestly, I don't know.
If you don't know, Ellie, we are dead. So.
Okay, so my personal view, and there's some support for that in the literature too, is that the inflation should increase. You should continue to inflate your GDP because inflate your threshold due to inflation, because your costs in your healthcare system to buy the same are increasing. And the counter argument to that is that and this is again theoretical, what NICE is doing is that NICE threshold is never fixed. The more cost-effective treatments you have, and as you displace more and less cost-effective interventions, your cost-effectiveness threshold is actually moving down. So say every new product in the last 50 years had a cost-effectiveness of £20,000 per QALY, and you have now eliminated any further treatment that is more than £20,000 per QALY, then clearly your cost-effectiveness threshold, or the product you will displace, is more cost-effective than it was before you started the program. So there are arguments in both ways. My personal view is that inflation should increase should increase the threshold. For increasing budget.
I have sorry to interrupt you, but my view with all these is that they are always going up, so it's hard for me to see a way of putting a threshold going down in any situation. Perhaps my question for you would be, when are you going down with a threshold in a HTA?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things, that NICE is a threshold searcher. And the idea of NICE is to drive the threshold down, the displacement threshold. So it's constantly going down. That's this is, again, theoretically, that's what should be happening. It's, again, questionable whether it does. If the healthcare budget increases, does that mean the threshold has to increase? Would someone support that?
No.
No. I mean, if you say I'm willing to pay more for health, I'm willing to pay more for a QALY, that's why I'm transferring more money to my healthcare budget. Does that then mean that you implicitly accepting a higher threshold?
I would deal with the opportunity costs and keep the threshold also low. So eliminate the less effective, because what ends up in reality is that we have a lot of less effective drugs or therapies or interventions, and they all stay in the market and the prices keep coming up. That's reality.
Yeah. Again, I don't really know. I think you're right. If in a sense, spending more on health seems to suggest that you're willing to pay more for a quality. At the same time, if you're using the argument that is one of efficiency, then you're better off at least leaving the threshold where it is, because you want not just to spend more, you also want to spend more within a healthcare system that is more efficient. For GDP,
let me ask you
sorry,
a question, just to accept. If that's the case in reality, then why generic drugs are sometimes more expensive than patent drugs in some countries, especially at the end of the patent period?
Okay. I think one of the things that the original pharma does is they start trading off on the name. You know, so the generic version of the patent holder is always more expensive than everybody else. And that's one of the reasons that farmers, when they advertise to medical professionals, never use the generic name. It's because they want, in their mind, they want to fix, you know, their trade name so that they know they're going to lose patent at some point. And my suspicion is that the generic that is more expensive is probably trading off on that recognition, and anybody else who enters the market will or should drop it really. Okay, increases in GDP. Fine. I mean, increase in GDP, I think, would depend on whether increase in GDP means that you're now willing to increase your budget. You know, maybe you're now willing to trade differently between health and other forms of consumption. But to my mind, just an increase in GDP shouldn't change the threshold just on its own. You know, unless there's a clear preference expressed that increased GDP will now preferentially be spent on health than anything else that people may want to spend it on. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Go on.
So I was just going to say, I think part of the problem is we're sort of comparing apples with pears, because to some extent in the US system, where they've got insurance-based sort of options, where ultimately the patient or the member of the public is paying for the service, it's a very different system to the NHS. So the thresholds set and the sort of way in which these things are calculated is somewhat opaque for, say, UK citizens, and they're not necessarily, they don't even know what's going on in terms of the judgment and the sort of criteria that are set. That's not to criticise you know, US more than UK or vice versa. It's just that there's a difference there that's quite fundamental. And in a sense, the other thing is, you know, we talk about treatment costs, but in something like oncology in the US, a lot of the time they are constantly scanning, they're constantly doing imaging, so that when someone's tumour is progressing or something like that, they've got more surveillance costs that are built into what they're paying for, whereas in the UK, that's often a cost that doesn't get as well accounted for. So it's things like that that mean that even if you're getting a treatment that's expensive, if you're getting it too late because your tumour's progressed and you haven't had the right sort of follow-up in terms of scans and such, that can also make a difference in terms of how the qualities are worked out and how the effectively cost effectiveness works. So it is really hugely complicated. I mean, what you've done today and tried to summarise this is a fantastic first step, but I just feel that it's so difficult to compare systems like the league tables approach that's probably part of why we're all stuck in a rut with this. I just wonder what your comments are on that.
I think, again, it depends on what it is. It goes back to the question: how are you going to use cost effectiveness, right? And this, here I'm focused on pretty much the way NICE envisages it, in that it's a displacement threshold. It's the cost effectiveness of what is being displaced, and this argument for that this is what drives efficiency within a healthcare system, either allocative efficiency or some form of technical efficiency, and logically that placement, I think is quite central to it. So though I'm talking about cost effective thresholds in general, I think I am focusing on the way NICE does things in the end, because that's theoretically has the firmest basis within the health economics. Yeah. Okay. Eric, I'm going to make you say that. You want to say that?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Ellie, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, so it's not just about affordability. Any health system may be able to afford a higher willingness to pay threshold, but that doesn't mean to say it should pay if the value or the incremental gains from any new drug aren't there. Because ultimately the health system just buys costs, not necessarily outcomes. And if these marginal gains are uncertain, then the uncertainty transfers onto patients. So we're asking patients to take drugs for which we know very little about potentially. So for me, I'm much more in favor of the threshold staying the same, but with some flexibility, and it being a kind of, as Mike Rollins used to say, a tool, not a rule. And we know what the target is.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. There's a slide later on that you get more and more health just because you have a higher threshold, and again, there's not much evidence, but we'll come to that slide. And I don't know, Francois is a resident wine expert. Maybe he can tell us if a 100-pound bottle.
I don't drink wine, so I have no idea. But
Francois, let us know. He'll probably say if the 25-pound bottle is French, then it's better. But, okay, I'm going to just.
It's too obvious.
Okay. Oh gosh. Okay, so this is the slide I wanted to show you. As you can see, this is cost effectiveness threshold plotted against health adjusted life years. So how many healthy life years you have, and as you can see that the threshold itself is not maybe vaguely related to how much how healthy your population is. The authors of this paper claim that there's an inflection in the curve at about $100,000 per QALY. I think you can't really draw any conclusions from this as to what should your threshold be, and beyond which there's a decreasing returns to spending more and more on health. Okay, so coming back to the NICE threshold, what we do know is that we have an estimate of marginal productivity, and that's not where the NICE threshold is set. In fact, I suspect if you set the NICE threshold at 12,000 pounds, NICE would have to pack up and go home, because in a short amount of time, they'd say no to every single new treatment, and they get closed down by the government of the day. The other thing we know is it does not represent displacement, and that is because we don't know what's being displaced. And we also know that the health system doesn't displace based on cost effectiveness. The other thing we need to consider here is that these two, the estimation of marginal productivity is assumed to be the same thing as the displacement threshold. Now, in a sense, it's a revealed displacement threshold. That's the best it is. But it is not the threshold the way NICE envisages, which is that it is the least cost-effective treatment or that you want to displace to gain efficiency. So oftentimes, and especially in Carl Claxton's work, these things seem to be pushed together as if they're the same thing. To my mind, they are not the same thing. Maybe the Carl Claxton's estimate is probably as good as we'll get to a marginal productivity estimate, but it does not tell you what should be displaced, what is not cost effective, how do we make the system efficient. All it tells you is if you use this threshold, you can be reasonably certain that your decisions are going to be in keeping with the changes caused by current decision making. And I'm not quite sure that that is exactly what the purpose of setting up NICE was. There's an interesting paper by McCabe et al., which is probably doctrine as far as NICE is concerned. And good way of looking at the threshold. The threshold is the threshold at which, beyond which other criteria should be taken into account. So that would be £20,000 is your threshold. And then you can take other factors into into consideration, though McCabe also say you shouldn't have a range of thresholds. That doesn't make sense. So we come back to the question that was asked, and this is how do you align price and value? And what I hope the argument I've made is that despite a firm theoretical underpinning within health economics, in practice, the NICE threshold is not doing what it's supposed to be doing for all kinds of reasons. I mean, that can hardly be counted as a fault or a reason why you don't do HTA, but it clearly isn't. So what NICE has done finally is found a way of negotiation by which price and value are aligned. These were implicit. They were called patient access schemes, or the company reducing its price to make sure its ISA was acceptable. But now we have a more explicit form of that negotiation, which is called the managed access agreement. So the managed access agreement gives coverage subject to certain conditions, such as price reductions or the need to collect additional evidence. And cost effectiveness is a powerful tool to go into those negotiations with. What it does is it uses reproducible, consistent methodology across all the products that the healthcare system could use, and it sets a threshold regardless of what the theoretical basis or empirical basis of that threshold is, and it goes into each negotiation and tells a pharmaceutical company, this is what I have offered your colleagues and competitors, and they have agreed. You need to justify to me why I should pay you more than I'm willing to pay every other pharmaceutical company. And that is a really powerful negotiating tool. Just to point out that in the end, these companies go away and negotiate with NHS England, not with NICE, and they agree to a confidential price or like a bulk buy, which we don't know. So in the end, the decision is not even made based on some assessment of the threshold. The managed access agreement it's a negotiation. And in the end, I suppose that is what an HTA process achieves. It achieves the basis of a negotiation with pharmaceutical companies. so that you align the price that the pharmaceutical company is willing to accept with the value that it provides to patients in the healthcare system. Okay, have we come to the, I had some other slides, but I don't really need to go through them. They're just clever slides, which I like. But I realized what I've not done is speak about COVID. So maybe a quick word about COVID now. And this is an economist's view on epidemiology. Economics is, they say it's a behavioral science. Some people question whether it's a behavioral, and most people question whether it's a science. So anyhow, economics does take a view on disease transmission in a pandemic, and that's what I'm going to leave you with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ali. Thank you, Ali. So we have time for a couple, well, I don't, anyone has a question? Sultan, you always has questions, so. Ali, thank you so much for the talk. Is my perspective is that I believe that it depends when you're measuring the threshold or HTA, it depends a lot on the situation. And I, as a clinician, when I joined the Master in Health Economics, is because I was interested in understanding how cost effectiveness works and so on. But from your perspective, what is the role that clinician could play in creating a more understanding and this threshold, or how can we push to make it a little more flexible, as Eric was saying, to play with that threshold depending on the disease that we are treating, all the medical devices and so on?
I mean, I actually think that is what is done in practice. So despite all this, I think it's always been so. The committee probably looks at a product, it speaks to experts, and decides, does it think it's a good idea to have this treatment, right? And that happens first. Then there's a way of making sure that the ICER supports that decision, right? So the committee will make a lot of effort to say yes to a product they think is useful, or find a way of saying yes, whether that's asking for a discount, whether that's managed access agreement, whether it's called optimizing recommendations to find patients who benefit from it, especially. There's many ways. So I think despite this theoretical underpinning, what you said, Bernardo, is what happens in practice. It's a much looser system. It's, you know, the threshold is put up there. It's not used the way the system, you know, claims it's being used.
I just want to clarify, is that nice that we're talking about? Because hypotheses, or we're talking about different procedure? We're talking about UK now.
Yeah, I think we're talking about
in the loose biased. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. There's a comment here from Chloe. Not all competition is based on price. Chloe, you like to expand on that?
That was just earlier when Sultan was asking about why certain generics are more expensive than brand names. And I was just highlighting that competition doesn't always happen based on price.
How would you differentiate a generic? I mean, other than this, I mean, it shouldn't be exactly the same.
It should, but the kind of strength of marketing, I guess, is to be able to create the sense in the consumer's mind that the product is different. And so doing so would allow you to charge a higher price than the brand name. Okay. Although I don't think that's very common, but
yeah.
Yeah, I think it was a rare case example where generics in general bring the market to this kind of competition to compare to the brand. But Ellie, I wanted to make a great presentation. It's a very controversial issue, and you know my position on threshold. We always first question when you start working at NICE is like, how did you come up with that whole threshold idea? And then the worst stage is when you work at NICE, you end up on stage and people ask you that question and you're supposed to know the answer. And that's not a very pleasant place to be, because as Ellie said, there's no empirical evidence for it. And of course, it's a political tool. And I think it's super important to understand that as tastes and weather changes, the tools adapt. And that's exactly what NICE has been doing, especially the 300K threshold for ultra-rare diseases is a very, very clear example where you fit whatever is needed into the framework. And I think if you start from the scientific perspective depicting how the threshold is derived, why is it there, it becomes, you empirically ruin that argument within 5 minutes. It's not going to hold whatsoever. And whatever Carl Claxton did in his work, I mean, he came up, the threshold needs to be half of what we're using, well, not half, but 13,000, yes. So from that point of view, all desires of pharma to have a higher threshold doesn't work. But then how does this work? Let's not forget about discounting, because we discount price and we discount qualities. And the big argument, should you discount at the same amount? But discount rate includes expected inflation rate. So, and then we have a ratio, like NICE's biggest defense, ratios should not change, ratios should stay the same. Mathematically, on that thing, they want to hold math and science true. Everything else scientific does not apply to the threshold. So there are a lot of these biased standards, but there is basically no logical precedent for a threshold increasing and then scientifically proving that, linking that to inflation or anything else, or decreasing. This is a political tool. And I think, if anything, it's a valuable tool, because when you ask, why on earth did you set up that price for that thing in America, and how did you come up with that price in France, and how did you come up with that price in Germany, NICE has a clear, book-perfect answer. They say, this is our methodology, these are different thresholds, these are all the exceptions. And that is a massive defense mechanism.
Yeah.
Because
yeah.
we have to buy the book. And how does that book work scientifically is a huge question. And in terms of containing prices, we know what's happening with expenditure on pharmaceuticals and PPRS, and how, like, in terms of what we spend percentage-wise and the absolute increase, it's not containing prices, it decreases access. But on the other hand, it does bring certain benefits for the budget. I think that really gets there. And I think, once again, we look at HTA as this kind of price setting mechanism. The way I look at HTA and what made me want to work at NICE or find why it's there is the interrogation of clinical evidence. And the whole fact that you say, the whole fact whoever develops that evidence, they know that they need to come to the table and they need to defend why they had that endpoint and why they ran that trial for that long. That is where the value of NICE comes in. And then that rigorous system, whether other countries are better or worse than that, it's another debate. But one thing that became clear, we disciplined the field a lot. We started collecting quality of life data, which out of, like, 15 years ago, no trial collected it. And now it's improving. So it's very difficult political question. It's not the best tool, it's a tool.
Yeah, no, I think, you know, you do your master's in economics or whatever, and you start working at NICE, and slowly you start realizing, you know, in real life, a lot of that theory is just unattainable. So I think this is one. Like I said, I think the other, the dirty secret is quality of life. You know, if one starts teasing it out from its theoretical beginnings and then follow it through to how it impacts decisions, you find something quite similar, that in the end it's not what it says on the tin. It's a pragmatic approach, and you know, and it's like you say, a political tool to knock prices.
More questions, comments? Francois, you want to add something? No, you're on mute. No.
No, thank you, Bernardo. It was brilliant. It was very interesting.
Because you were on mute. Sorry about that. Okay, it has been really insightful and a lot to study and consider with this political tool that we have. And next week we have Lisa. Hopefully she will be talking about really nice adventures in nature, and looking forward to see all of you next week again. Thank you so much for joining.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Cheers, bye.